Good afternoon, and thank you for attending Research During COVID-19, part of Virtual AHA. I'm Sara Weichsel, the AHA's Director of Research and Publications. In July 2020, the AHA issued a statement urging universities to make a series of specific accommodations for faculty and students whose research has been interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We're looking forward to a productive discussion on this topic with our panelists, and we are excited to have you all join us. A few logistical things to cover before we jump into the webinar. All participants are muted. If you run into any technical issues, please use the chat box and AHA will do the best to assist you. To submit questions to the presenters, please use the Q&A function. We hope to address all relevant questions, but also want to be mindful of our timekeeping. We have a number of people viewing the webinar through Facebook Live, so please use the comment section to submit questions there. AHA staff will pass those along to the presenters. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared after the live session. By registering for or participating in the AHA's web-based events, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator today, Sara Giorgini, who is a member of the AHA's Council and Research Division and the series editor for the Papers of John Adams, which is part of the Adams Papers Project at the Massachusetts Historical Society. She is also the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family. As a historical editor, she publishes authoritative editions of the founders' words, leads student and teacher workshops, curates manuscripts and artifacts and thematic exhibits, and brings her expertise to the broad audience of groups like National History Day. Sara, I will now turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you to the American Historical Association, to all of you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. As Sara mentioned, our conversation today really takes its roots from the July 2020 statement on doing historical research during COVID-19. And we're coming together today to think about some principles and practices that we can really embrace now and going forward. So I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panel of scholars. First up, Christopher Boyer, a counselor in our research division and professor of history and Latin American and Latino studies. He is Dean of the College of Arts and Letters and Professor of History at Northern Arizona University, where he teaches courses on social and environmental history of modern Mexico and Latin American history generally. He's published widely in English and Spanish. His most recent book is Political Landscapes, Forests, Conservation, and Community in Mexico, which investigates the social history of forest management between 1880 and 2000. With a special emphasis on the experiences of Chihuahua and Michoacan. Welcome, Chris. Sara Mellors is counselor at large for the AHA and an assistant professor of history at Missouri State University. Her research focuses on modern Chinese history, gender and sexuality, and the history of medicine. Her dissertation, From Vinegar and Cotton Balls to Diaphragms and Vasectomies, Birth Control in Republican and Mao-era China, examines birth control practices in 20th century urban China before the implementation of the one-child policy. As the AHA's counselor at large, she serves as a member of the Graduate and Early Career Committee and represents its interests. Welcome, Sara. Dana Rabin is the interim chair and professor of history at University of Illinois Urbana-Champagne, as well as the Lynn M. Martin Professorial Scholar. Dana specializes in the history of 18th century Britain with an emphasis on crime, law, gender, and race. Dana's current project, Jews, Suffrage, and the Color Line in the British Empire, 1740 to 1858, examines Jewish civil rights throughout the British Empire. This multi-sided project takes note of the empire's metropole and its colonial spaces, plantation societies, and settler colonies, to study how definitions of race and religion shaped the lives of Jews and definitions of Jewishness and whiteness. Welcome, Dana. And finally, please join me in welcoming Marc Rodriguez, professor of history at Portland State University and editor of the Pacific Historical Review. Before joining the faculty of Portland State, Rodriguez taught at Princeton University, the University of Notre Dame, and Indiana University South Bend, where he served as director of the Civil Rights Heritage Center. Marc is a leading scholar in the field of Mexican-American Chicano history and the author of Rethinking the Chicano Movement and the Tejano Diaspora, Mexican Americanism and Ethnic Politics in Texas and Wisconsin. Welcome, Marc. So thank you all for joining us and helping us to kind of develop some of the themes that came out of that AHA statement. Our conversation is going to move through three parts. First, we're going to talk about communities that are most vulnerable to research access needs right now, our graduate students and independent scholars. Then we'll talk about some of the challenges that faculty across the country and beyond are facing right now during the pandemic. And finally, we'll come together to think about ways to collaborate and create scholarship for publication. How is the current pandemic affecting our timelines, our workflows, and our production of scholarship for publication? So first off, I want to get into some of the questions that we've collected online and from our AHA communities. And first up, I'd really like to hear about how we can advocate for graduate students right now, whose work has been stalled or slowed down by COVID. Now, this pandemic is world-changing and history-making for sure, but many of us remember back to the beginning days of our dissertations when we couldn't automatically take a trip to a foreign archive, and we have to kind of think back to how exactly we began those research projects. And here, Sara Mellors, I'd ask you to weigh in about what it's like to start a dissertation project and what kind of resources you can tap into before getting to those foreign archives.
Thank you, Sara. So I can speak personally to what my subfield is kind of doing to deal with this crisis. And it actually has broader implications for me, for example, my institution doesn't have any real holdings or database access that could benefit me in terms of my own research. But as a subfield, the subfield of modern Chinese history has come together in part due to UC Irvine's Long Institute, which organized a workshop where all of the leading scholars in the field basically got together on Zoom and put forth ideas of ways that students can do their research. They mentioned open access databases, different places where you can access newspapers and periodicals online. People put forth private collections and have digitized them. And so everybody worked together kind of in a way that made it seem more possible for graduate students who are really have had their plans stalled. They can still do some of that work from home. Yeah, so I think the best thing that can be done, in addition to, of course, adding more time for completing research and writing, et cetera, and just generally being more accommodating, is if a subfield as a whole can come together and make a list of these resources and put aside money to some extent and make things at least temporarily open access so graduate students have some way of pursuing the projects they've worked so hard to develop.
So it sounds like that collaboration across subfields is important, access is important, and also mentoring is really important. So for the professors on the panel, how are you advising your grad students right now? What's the mentoring opportunity?
I can start. I feel that as a chair, I'm really encouraging the faculty at large to mentor with special and care and consistency, and maybe more outreach than we usually, if that's your style, that you don't, that you have more of a hands-off attitude. I would encourage faculty to be in touch with their students more. In terms of intellectually framing projects, we're trying to encourage our faculty to rethink think with their students about what kinds of projects they can do from here. And sometimes that means that the student is disappointed. Sometimes the faculty member is disappointed. Sometimes they both are. And I do think that everyone is extremely triggered right now by everything. And so I think being extremely sensitive and considerate is really important. You know, I can't impress upon faculty enough about the reaching out part. We have student appreciation days next week, and we're thinking about, do we send them candy, you know, non-chocolate for the international students, and you know, chocolate for the American students, whatever, whoever's in the country. So I just think it's really important and complicated, and is going to need more attention.
I might second that. I think that one of the real pivotal strategies right now should be for both mentors, but for students themselves, to double down on communication. Make sure that your faculty mentors are aware of where you stand in the process and what sorts of roadblocks you might be experiencing. Make sure that librarians are aware of your research. Archivists are aware of your research. If you are, as in many cases, not able to travel to where your archives might be located, consider reaching out to archivists. Some of them may be working remotely, but some of them may not. It's really highly dependent on locale and sort of what COVID political culture. So the more that you can make your colleagues, your faculty, and your supporters, your network of supporters, and by that I really do mean librarians and archivists, aware and scholars in the places where you are doing, where your research is centered. The more that people know that you are looking for things, the better off you'll be. People really, I think, are hungry to engage in new ways at this precise moment. And while we're all more pressed for time than we've ever been, I also think that a lot of people are feeling more hungry for quality intellectual exchange than in pre-COVID times, perhaps.
Marc, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I've noticed is, well, Portland State is an R2 university. So, you know, in terms of funding and things like that, we have issues. We also are only an MA program. And so what I've done with the students that I advise is basically talk to them about, you know, what's possible during this time period. Some of those students are interested in public history careers. So the way that they frame their projects now might change, but their end goal might be working for a historical society somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And so, you know, I've been talking to them about what the variables are for actually completing the work and how they can do it. But just to sort of reaffirm what people have said about actually talking to students, I got a little bit, you know, sort of busy in September and didn't check in with my students. And, you know, when I did, I realized that basically, you know, their August and September was kind of terrifying. As they were getting ready, they were, in one particular case, one of my graduate students had a project that would have been great if they could go do it, and has been really impressive. Came up with an alternative project that looks like it's going to fly. And, you know, a lot of our students will be writing a master's thesis with the real goal, having that as part of their application materials for a doctoral program, right? So, you know, that's a very different kind of graduate preparation, graduate goal. The other thing too, and I think this speaks to the idea of access, is that we really haven't, at my university in particular, you know, we don't have access to a lot of the great database systems that you have at your R1s. That's the first thing I noticed when I came to Portland State. Things I expected to see weren't here. And so we've already been working with our students who don't have those things. But now it's even more difficult because, say, for example, we would send them up to University of Washington or down to University of Oregon, where all those databases are available in the library. Now we really need to think about ways that maybe cooperative institutions could allow for password access for students from, say, smaller schools or less well-funded schools, because that's come up as an issue.
Are there particular research databases that you're interested in for your subfields or for your students to explore more? Are there kind of key troves that you would very much like access to?
I would just say that for Americanists, it's the historical newspaper databases and some of those early America databases. A lot of them are quite affordable, but some of them are particularly expensive. And so larger, less well-funded universities find those easy things to cut. And I know, for example, that the desire of people to work in certain universities has led some of the larger universities, I'm thinking of the University of Washington, for example, to no longer as easily give out sort of faculty associate or visiting graduate student status. So they get login credentials to use those things. That's not meant as a criticism. It's just a budget issue for them, I think, during normal years. But those are the kinds of things that students take for granted and then they're gone.
And that's going to be particularly difficult for students as they finish up. We have a lot of students who are on that brink, and some of them want to stay longer as students. And part of the reason is funding, but part of the reason is also access to the library. So as they look to being independent scholars, as opposed to, employed, given the job market this year, I think that's really a consideration.
I also think that it's important to think about, speaking as a Latin Americanist, since US-based scholars cannot travel to Mexico, and actually most of Latin America and most of the, like most of the world, archives are closed there. There are some online resources. It's very important to be, I think, entrepreneurial about looking at what they might be. Sometimes they're kind of hidden. There are, as Marc was pointing out, there are some free open access newspaper collections. Most of these are somewhat less open access, but again, there might be some ability to reach out to the people who are in control of these, the research newspaper archives. And if you can be very, very specific about what you're looking for, you may be able to find some help there. But I also think that it's important for students and their mentors to be thinking about alternative forms of what constitutes a primary source. We are, of course, a very textually based discipline, and that's a fine thing. But I also think that was changing before COVID, and that as people think about how one can construct the past, that we have been consistently as a discipline, I think, given sort of short shrift to what gets called material culture in our discipline.
Speaking of material culture, there's actually, for example, the history of medicine, there's a lot of wonderful open access sources online through the Wellcome Trust, through the NIH, through the Library of Congress. And I am at an R2 university as well, with very limited resources, I would say, for research. But for example, my MA students are doing projects where they have to investigate free open access, caches of primary sources and analyze them and share them with the class. And my students have come up with all sorts of things that with these images or bits of text, that with contextualization, with some library books, these could be really interesting lines of inquiry. So I think that turning to material culture would be a great option.
I thank the panelists, because I love that you've put your students first in thinking about the production of the next wave of scholarship, and to think generously about primary sources while mentoring them to produce it is, I think, really extraordinary. I want to move into kind of the second part of our conversation about the role of department chairs during this current challenge to research. And I want to ask, how can we advocate for faculty whose research has been slowed or stalled? Some were out last semester, some were on leave this semester. How can they kind of make up the time that's been lost?
Sara, I put that question up because I am dealing with it daily. It's really a problem that I'm gonna look upwards in my institution because the dollars of covering the teaching and just allowing for that kind of release. If people took it last year and then were not able to actually go to the archives or write because they have small children at home or an elderly parent, it's not just heteronormative reproductivity. This crisis is affecting different people in different ways, and really time is the resource that we have the least of. I think we all agree. So, and it's the hardest to replace. So that is something that is very live question. I want to do it equitably and consistently and transparently. So that's another aspect, which then takes a lot of time because democracy is very inefficient, as you all know. But it's still the only way that I can think that is the way to do it. So, so course release is one way. I was thinking about ways in which perhaps we could bring undergraduate RAs into the picture and graduate students to help faculty with their work and perhaps move the project along. But I'm open to lots of different ideas, so I'll be quiet and listen.
I'm a dean now, and it does help that I'm a historian, so I'm particularly sensitive to the sorts of scholarship that goes on within history and allied fields that can require a greater amount of time than other shorter term research, although I would point out that our colleagues across the university in certain areas, biology has been very hard hit, and on and on. I do think, again, communication is key. I think that most R1s and R2s have made accommodations for early career scholars. Whether those are adequate is a different question. But certainly if you happen to be in an early career scholar and are needing more time, there are limits of research money. There are sometimes it's structurally difficult, but I would point out that the AHA does have a statement that advocates for slowing down tenure clocks. That's happened at many institutions. If it has not happened at your institution, I do think that, you know, at least making sure that that is on the radar of the administration is key. And I also think that keeping your own house in order within history departments, for example, making sure that if you are going to try to expand what constitutes research, and if that is somehow written down in some document, make sure that that document, if you're going to say we're happy if people look at monuments, we're happy if people, you know, look at fiction, alternative sources that people might be using now. In some instances, that would need to be written down, or would need to change existing documentation for what constitutes research productivity, promotion and tenure, and on and on. So we're getting into the weeds a little bit here, but I would just say that this speaks again to the need for communications across different levels to make sure that administrators are aware of the challenges, because some of them, quite frankly, are not. Let me just briefly point out, Michael Reese did ask a question that we might want to loop around to at the end about making sources available through a clearinghouse. That is somewhat challenging because some of these sources can't be just sort of widely challenged. They are in archival, widely shared, that is, but maybe we can come back to that later on.
Marc, did you want to chime in on this idea of kind of the needs of faculty research, whether it's redefining what constitutes the output of research right now, or kind of finding other ways to advocate for faculty?
Yeah, I think, you know, moving to Portland State, it's the first place I've ever worked where the faculty are actually in a union. And I was at the Labor and Working Class History Association meeting, sort of teasing some of my friends about the fact that they've never been in unions. And setting that aside as a joke, what I would say is the AAUP has developed a variety of memorandum of understanding sort of templates to think about. And our institution has adopted most of those, with the administration getting together with our union representatives to accept them and implement them. And the AAUP website has information on this stuff that I would suggest people have a look at. That's probably helpful for chairs. They could suggest some of those ideas to their administrative sort of leads and see what happens. But I think the main thing is making sure that the tenure clocks are extended, making sure that the faculty are reminded 3 years from now to respect that, because that can be a problem, right? People, you know, this sort of issue has come up before with family and medical leave, right? And so, you know, some people in departments need to be reminded, you know, that so-and-so has an extension on their tenure clock 5 years from now, right? You know, and I think that's something that administrators probably need to also remember. You know, 5 years from now, the people coming up for tenure or promotion will have had a COVID experience that might actually be something that impacts us for a couple of years, right? So people that had sabbatical last year and were forced to come back in December or January, whatever, or people who have postponed sabbatical, like I've done. I was supposed to be on sabbatical right now, and what am I going to do? So we were able to postpone and sort of have it next year. But again, you know, it's unclear what will happen after that. And so, I mean, there are a lot of what ifs in the future for faculty, for administrators. And I think the best thing for universities to do is through faculty senates where they're not represented, to think about using some of those AAUP templates, quite honestly, to think about standards for review. And then in particular for assistant professors who might lose 1.5 years here, to think, how do you treat assistant professors in a way that is humane and responsible? And I think that's something we're going to need to think about. And then as for topics and materials that can be considered primary sources, I was just speaking to a student who was writing on ethnicity and material culture in particular. And we shifted to sort of thinking about how cookbooks could be a window into ethnicity in the 1920s. And I didn't know anything about them. And so I got copies of them. And apparently there are people on the internet who created these databases. And some of them I thought were amazing, you know, like fill in the name of ethnicity, guide to raising a healthy family. And I thought, wow, you know, this is visually interesting. And then my student said, as a public history sort of student, maybe I could do some YouTube videos where I actually use the recipes. And I'm thinking, well, you know, that actually might make you a sort of somebody with a TV show down the road rather than a professor, but that'd be great. So yeah, I think we need to be creative and let our students be creative.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dana.
I just wanted to add that we had an implementation team, and I was the chair of the subcommittee on research and professional development. And one of the things we did is change the way that we write letters to evaluators, tenure evaluators, so that the COVID language is in there. Just speaking to Marc's point about the fact that this is going to last a while and people have to have a memory for it. So I definitely think both internally to our colleagues voting on tenure, but also to the evaluators. And the other thing is that we have the tenure rollback. That's not a problem, but how do you get back the time? So that's what we're dealing with, step 2 of that.
Can I just ask, in kind of my position coming from Massachusetts Historical Society, we're always interested in collaborative bridges with universities, colleges, schools. We're always thinking, what's the collection you wish was digitized? What's the we really need to kind of beef up that access? And I wondered if each of you had kind of an archive you wished was available online, or that you could bring your students to virtually and have them perhaps transcribe and digitize? Because it's certainly true that research is going to take many different final forms now, right? So it could be a documentary, it could be a documentary edition, it could be co-curating an exhibit at a local historical society. These are all things that can go on your CV anytime, but especially now. So I wonder if there are any kind of collaborative opportunities with archives, institutions, museums that are kind of on your wish list. Are there big anniversaries coming up that you're planning to teach that you wish you had something for? Because I think folks who are attending this seminar or watching it later on, we'd be really interested to know. So anyone want to take that one?
I can tell you that I taught, as a British legal historian of the 18th century, the history of the University of Illinois. And boy, they never listened as closely to crime and gender in the early modern world as they did the history of the U of I. And the reason that I taught it is because I wanted them to go into the archives. And this is before COVID. So that's my experience with it. It was for our sesquicentennial. Because I did crime and resistance and rebellion on campus, the chancellor wasn't so happy with me. I came to every event and he was like, I was like, I'm doing crime at the U of I. And he was like, oh, shush. But anyway, and I was fine not being in the triumphalist parade there. They love going into the archives. So these kinds of collaborations are really important and can yield extremely exciting experiences for our students. So any that you would have on offer, I would certainly, given my time period working with the Massachusetts Historical Society, would work very, very well. And if we could come up with something like that and be invited to do it, that would maybe help us in. So.
I would say that one of the real challenges that people who work in archives in the developing world often run into is that when there are sources available outside of archives, sometimes it's on the web. In Mexico, for example, there's a terrific web presence of colonial documents. It's not perfect, but it's much better than what there is for the modern era, which is the time I work on. What is available for widespread use are collections of newspapers and sometimes collections of diplomatic correspondence, which can actually function as newspapers as well and be used in a number of ways, everything from sort of gender studies to imperialism studies to, nuts and bolts of what happened on this day. The challenge is that many of these are still on microfilm. And so sort of fitting back in with the point that I made previously about the need to be in communication, is it possible for a department to make available to a student or a faculty member a microfilm reader? A lot of universities actually happen to have some of these things lying around in dusty corners. And my former institution at University of Illinois at Chicago has made, the library will let you borrow for some period of time a microfilm reader if you can get the microfilm. So putting all these things together, again, is possible to do, but it requires entrepreneurialism and, again, communications with everybody who might be interested in helping you along with this process.
Sara M., do you have any thoughts to add there on how to access kind of, Asian history resources right now and things that we could be collaborating on?
Well, maybe this is idealistic, but I'd like to call on very wealthy R1 universities who I know you have priceless collections that even if you were just to digitize part of them could be a real game changer for thousands of students and researchers, both inside of the academy and outside of it. But also, I guess I don't have a specific database I would be interested in, so much as kind of like Marc said, just general newspaper, not having access to newspapers in one's own field. It's a really odd experience. And if I don't refer back to like my alma mater for help, I literally cannot access newspapers except for these new up and coming like open access projects that various institutions are funding. So I really just hope we can go more in the direction of digitizing for the masses, as opposed to having things squirreled away and only limited to elite universities.
If it's all right, I'd like to jump in there because there's something that I've noticed. It's that the sort of life of the mind question, and I think it relates to sort of how people are kind of doing during this very difficult time. It's a couple of our students have been really good at looking at websites at top research centers, right? So, you know, take for example, the research centers Ivy League institutions have and other places where they do weekly workshops and they have people talking about their works in progress. That can be amazing for students and for faculty. And what I've noticed is some places have those now open because they have Zoom or they're using something like that. And one of the things I heard from one of our students who's been really entrepreneurial about sitting in for these things is she said, basically, I would like it if those rich places, right, you know, kept these things going, even if we had to be muted, you know, like I understand a workshop, 12 people around a table, you know, you want those people all talking to one another. But if the people who are now able to see it via Zoom could continue to do so in the future, maybe they don't get to ask questions. But that's the kind of thing where some institutions could really help the community of scholars by letting people sit in at one of those amazing seminars and, you know, keep that up as something to do moving forward, because our Japanese Studies Center, which gets some support from Japanese companies and, you know, has people talk every week or so. I mean, we had one last night. It was amazing. And what I thought was really great about it was that the people who attended were attending from Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the entire United States. And, you know, it was funny because, you know, you would see people where it was 4 a.m. where they were, and they wanted to attend this lecture. And I think there are opportunities for people to be, you know, become part of larger communities if those opportunities to Zoom in are made available and continue to be made available in the future.
I love this idea of community building through kind of opening up the academic process to the general public to a degree. There's been a flurry of, you know, Zoom book talks and virtual conferences, new ways to really introduce folks to your work in progress, which can be so fruitful to do in multiple sites. We had a question about advocating for the continuation of humanities research, and it sounds like part of the answer is build a community, build a fan base outside your university, because people are really interested in Zooming in to hear about your work. So that's really heartening to hear. And I'd encourage folks to check out all of those free talks and lectures as they're made available. I want to spend a little time moving to the third part of our conversation now, because while book talks and conferences and open colloquia are wonderful, there is still the tried and true standard we haven't talked about yet in research, which is publishing it. So I want to take a little time to talk about how academic publishing has changed, how the landscape has shifted, the needs have shifted, and then we'll open it up to some questions from the floor. So fire up that Q&A with your questions while we're talking here about publishing, and we'll dive into them in a little bit. But first off, and Marc, I'm going to go to you because this is kind of a journal editor question I have immediately. How can we adjust timelines, authors, referees, and book reviewers to accommodate this new work life of the mind in 2020?
Yeah, I think, first of all, our submissions are still coming in. I find that people took the spring to finish up work they'd been sort of putting off. And so our graduates who help process all that stuff, our graduate students, this summer were kind of freaking out. They're like, you know, isn't everybody supposed to be panicked and not doing their work? So I was really impressed by the people who were out there in May, finishing up article, polishing the work and getting it to us. I think that there's been some discussion that we followed about like who is submitting and what the breakdown is on that. We have not seen any significant discrepancies between gender and things like that. We're actually getting I think we actually have more submissions from junior scholars who may be caring for children, it seems. We usually get emails where they tell us, you know, about their process right now. And that's the other thing I would mention. I'm finding that referees need more time. And they often tell me about children or parents who they're now caring for. We had one case where somebody was caring for a 90-something-year-old parent and a 10-year-old. And that was a single family. And so I was just impressed that that person even found time to review for us. And so we've had to extend out those deadlines for referees. We also have anticipated that authors are taking more time to do revisions. And I think that's something that, not so much in the United States, but in places like the UK and Canada, Australia, they have these weird rules now about like how quickly things are supposed to be published. And some of them are not really sensible for the humanities, right? So the idea that, you know, they want to know the date you submit an article in Canada, and they want to know the date it was published, and that somehow has something to do with how it's valued. And I've had these conversations with international faculty about how difficult those new systems are. And so I think the important thing for departments and for scholars is to sort of point out to their departments, you know, that these things are taking longer. And I know from people I talk to in book publishing, the same things are happening. Referees are taking longer to review the book. Authors don't have the ability to sort of go back to the archive and change things or work on those things. So it might be, and I'm thinking about articles and book projects where they need major revision or significant revision to an area. If you can't get back to that archive, you're going to have to set that aside for a little while, because no creative sort of thinking is going to get the archive open if it's not. And so I think, you know, that's a part of the process and delay that we have to deal with. But I've really been impressed by the number of people who are getting the work done, and when it's possible, getting it back to us in a timely manner. Book reviewers are always late, so that's kind of something that I've been used to. But again, we're hearing more about the family situations. We're hearing more about the way in which those things are taking up, you know, the 9-to-5 schedule for many people. We're also hearing from single parent families about their process. And so I think what's interesting for me is I've gotten to know people that I probably wouldn't have known that much about their personal lives. And I've also had, say, for example, in my reminding people that they're overdue, I've gotten to know people in a much more personal way. Because, you know, I mean, a colleague doesn't send in a report and they are embarrassed. And when I remind them, they realize that, you know, it's kind of serious, I guess. And we always are willing to give people that moment to do the work. Again, my concern is, how do the authors of articles or books, I'm guessing, you know, make these things clear to their chairs and their departments? And then how does their university respond to that? Not this year and next year, but 3 years from now. If someone's book project is delayed because they needed to go and do new work on chapter 3 and 4 that they can't do until next year, what does that do for us in terms of thinking about the feasibility of the old time clock working for them? And so we're doing as much as we can. And I've written some letters to people who we've published, basically explaining kind of what our delay and what our time to publication looks like right now, so that they have a letter like that they can show to their chair. And their chair might be able to use that to explain to the dean, who may not be a humanities person.
Dana and Chris, can you jump in on this? Because it's really interesting to hear, to get that chair's and dean's perspective on how you're thinking or rethinking the accepted versus published kind of significance for academic work right now.
I'm going to let Chris go because he's the dean.
It still doesn't seem normal. Look, I think that institutionally, this is a great moment for chairs to be thinking interdisciplinarily, both in terms of scholarship, teaching, and research, but also in terms of making sure that there is a consistent message coming from a variety of different fields and departments. So what is hard for administrators to hear is, well, my discipline is special, and so we need to create a whole new set of regulations or operating procedures to accommodate this particular field. Whereas when chairs get together and say, look, biology has this problem, the fine arts cannot present live, and what they can do is in a very attenuated way. The people who are doing urban sociology cannot go to urban areas and do sociology right now. And by the way, history also has these problems. That is the winning strategy to get administrators to pay attention and think, oh, yes, this is actually a systemic problem. And it is a systemic problem. We have our problems in this discipline, but we're not alone. And I think that being not alone actually is a message that we need to repeat again and again. And you know, I think Marc's point, and Dana's as well, that, you know, let's not just think about this year, but let's think 3-5 years down the pike. You know, and maybe this is the time to ask ourselves, are promotion and tenure regulations in history, must it be only a book? Must that book only be you know, between covers? You know, maybe that's right. Maybe I'm not going to try to advocate on one side or another for that, but I think that these are questions that were being asked again before the COVID pandemic occurred, and that they are all the more urgent now.
Do you want to add anything there, Dana?
I totally agree. And we were actually, it's interesting because we were looking at our promotion standards to full last year, right before the pandemic. And we changed them in the most minuscule way. We moved the needle just barely. And now the whole landscape's changed. And that conversation is all the more relevant and important. And it may be time to move the needle much more.
So we're going to keep thinking this question, I think, together of how to research during COVID. And we're going to do it by taking a couple questions now from the floor. And I want to start with this one because this returns to where we started with kind of our most vulnerable communities. And Sara, I think this one is probably most for you first. So if a PhD master's student runs out of funding during COVID and finds employment, do you think universities and departments should allow students to finish their dissertations remotely or part-time?
Well, actually, even if there wasn't a pandemic, I think that universities should be thrilled that their students are getting employment and do everything they can to support those students. And since we're in a moment when equity and inclusion these are kind of watchwords that are circulating all around, there's no better time to be thinking about how this health crisis is affecting people so unevenly. And I think it's imperative that to the extent possible, professional associations and university faculty and staff and administrators really try to do everything they can to be accommodating. I don't think anybody does less work because they have nothing else to do. We're all so swamped, and now if I don't get an email quickly or I don't send an email in a timely fashion, I just always assume the person must be as swamped as I am. And I think we need to absolutely be thinking about the people who don't have the privilege of being in a webinar or don't have the privilege of being able to speak up for themselves or don't have a regular salary to rely on. So I think just a general politics of compassion and more community at the risk of sounding corny would be really important.
I love that, the politics of compassion and kind of broadening it. Can I hear from maybe Dana, Marc, and Chris on this, on advising grad students who are in those final stages, who are trying to finish and get on the market right now? What are you saying to them?
Well, I have somebody right now, a student, my advisee, and she did an amazing job last year on the job market. There were a lot of jobs. She got interviews at all of them. She just didn't make it to the next. And then now it's all shut down. And so that is a really, really difficult, we've been having, every conversation is difficult as she comes to terms with not being able to pursue a job in academia, and she's sort of decided, I keep encouraging her, but there aren't any jobs to apply for. So I think it's been a very, very difficult thing for our students, extremely difficult. I have another student who, just as this person describes, if they get a job, of course, I'll be supportive of her finishing whenever she's ready. And that's always been the case. Finishing up remotely, trying to make an arrangement with your employer, perhaps, to have some dedicated time to writing so that one day you'll cross that finish line. I think that's great. The other thing we've done in our department is to make this year that is kind of a postdoc year for some of our students, a lot of them, about 25 students who could be finished if they had jobs to go to make it kind of a postdoc year and work with them on not only job applications and career diversity, but also book proposals, grant writing, and article writing. So if we're going to have sessions on each of these and workshops between the sessions on each of the projects to help them, because that's what we are good at. I can't really teach them how to go out and get a job outside of academia, although I can help, but what we're good at is writing articles and book proposals and these kinds of things. And so we're trying to give them that kind of help, no matter what next year is.
I can speak to the master's students who are, a much more diverse group in terms of what their goals are. Some of our students have interestingly gotten jobs after graduation in public relations, where they probably make more than I do. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that coming from PhD granting institutions to an MA granting institution, I've sort of taken a look at the way in which students at that level are kind of forced to be creative, right? With programs admitting fewer PhD students, a lot of them are going to Plan B. And I think we had one student interview recently with a digital media company. And that just made me sort of, wow, you're going to get paid a lot of money, I guess. But the other thing I thought that was interesting is I know that the professional development people at the AHA and other places have been working on this for a long time. But the skill set that you have as a historian, editing, taking words and sentence structure very seriously, are things that, a lot of companies out there, the big tech companies, could really use. They do produce a lot of bad copy, and our students, whether they're MA students or PhD students, know how to write. And if they themselves aren't that great at writing, I don't feel that I'm a very good writer, they can be great editors. And so I think students are thinking at the MA level, kind of seriously about how to sort of pivot to something different. And I've been really impressed by our students who do that. I'm concerned about our MA students who want to apply to PhD programs. The news they're hearing through sort of online discussions is that an institution that admitted 14 people last year might be admitting 3 this year, or 5, or some lower number. And I don't know how much of that's hearsay and how much of that's truth, but I think that there are concerns there about those students who might be getting ready for something like that. And I'm doing my best to try to make sure that their project is as interesting and creative as it can be.
I also think this is a time for students to think seriously about the challenges that are going to be coming forward. The job market was bad before COVID, and we all know that it's not been any improvement since then. So one thing to think about is what your aspirations are if you are in graduate school. Is it to teach at an R1 institution? In that case, I think you need to be very clear-eyed about the challenges that are involved in that. But is it to be a historian and to actually be able to work on your craft in one context or another? In that case, I would say you really would be well advised to think about adding one new skill to your quiver. There is a huge demand right now out there for course builders for online education. Many of these people are not trained in the humanities or in history, and many historians are not really going to seek out, I think, the sorts of skills that it takes to be an excellent course builder at the same time. So look at the School of Education at your institution. Do they offer something? If not, think about where you might be able to get those kinds of skills so that you can actually not only show that you have those skills, but be able to walk in and do this kind of work that is going to be around for a little while to come. And think about the sort of hybrid positions that are also, I think, more common within universities these days, in which you are teaching some of the time, but administering some of the other part of the time. Do you have administrative skills? How could you build those up? Could you work within an institution? Should you be thinking about taking a couple of courses from the business school? These are things that we have, in my experience, not really encouraged students to do. But I think that now is the time to actually think about that, how you can add that one other component to your own professional development.
Course building is such an interesting idea too, because you're thinking about how to package and repackage your research for different audiences, just a range of people that you can really share your finds with, which I think is important. And I'd point to, and perhaps some folks can drop this in the chat, the really excellent career diversity resources that the AHA has available. Some really important initiatives and resources that students and faculty can access online for free via the AHA website. So I want to move actually into a question that we have from the audience about the AHA's role during this moment, research-wise, which is, will professional associations like the AHA engage universities to ask them to change their career progression, tenure, research reviews, et cetera, criteria and practices to accommodate the delay of scholarly output that is coming down the line next year and after due to the disruption and stunting of archival and in-person research projects by their faculty? So kind of a question we've circled around and talked about a little bit, but what should be the AHA's role here in engaging with universities?
I'm going to answer that question quickly, and then I'm going to have to make my apologies and leave a little bit before the other panelists. I'm sorry, I have another meeting. I did post in the chat. There is a statement by the AHA that is intended to do that. The AHA needs to be careful about how far it wants to tell what universities should do. But I think that there is a wide recognition that in some cases it would make sense to slow down and to respond to the needs of faculty, graduate students, particularly at the earlier phases of their careers. And I would just make one more plea to keep in mind that our sister institutions, the MLA, Anthropology, have made similar statements. So again, bundling these statements to say that we're not alone in this, but that this is something that is affecting all of higher education right now is, I think, really pivotal. And I want to thank you for indulging me, and good luck with the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Chris. Happy researching. Dana, do you want to jump in on that?
I think that there's a role. I think that there's definitely place. I would want the AHA to, if we're gonna weigh in also in terms of access to databases and access to scholarship and books, and so I guess it's a matter for discussion, and certainly for yeah. So I do think people are waiting for the AHA to perhaps say something along these lines regarding tenure and promotion. I have heard that.
Sarah, do you want to weigh in here as well?
Sure. Yeah, these types of questions are excellent, but also a little bit tricky to answer. On the one hand, I think the AHA wants to do whatever its membership wants it to do. It wants to support them. On the other hand, it is an external organization, and its advice or 2 cents is not always welcome at particular universities, and every university is a little bit different. But I think we could easily pledge to do more, to put more attention or spend more time perhaps releasing statements or pushing for the AHA membership to include access to more databases, or trying to coordinate a little bit better so we not only meet the needs of the membership, but just make the discipline better as a whole.
I think we have to also keep in mind the toll that this COVID-19 is taking on our efforts at diversity and equity and inclusion. And that's where I want to hear the AHA talking. Because certainly our undergraduate students, first gen and underrepresented students are taking this a hit in COVID at a higher rate. Our enrollments are great, but first gen and underrepresented students came back at much lower numbers. So I think that kind of intervention would also be extreme. I know it's not research, but I think that's an important voice that the AHA can be.
Yeah, I would just add, there's the risk there that a whole pipeline of students gets lost. And I think the other thing that we're now taking seriously is that the class background of our students is often very different, and that the things that their parents or family members do for a living is going to be really impacted differently for very different parts of our communities. And I've seen that here, where most of our students are working students at the undergraduate level. And we've seen sort of some of their families decimated financially as a result of this. And so, I think by the time we got to our 6th week of enrollment, some people just stopped showing up. And you can see inside those online teaching platforms who's reading and who's not, right? And so I think I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that this is a much shorter problem. But I am really concerned that, those whose parents have lost jobs are not going to school this term, or they're leaving.
Yeah, I think something that's come out in our conversation about historical research is just the depth and breadth, right, of communities that are affected, but who are also important to the work that we do as scholars. And that's a good thing to acknowledge. I want to read this question from the chat, and I'll read it exactly. So, an archivist librarian here, and speaking on behalf of my tribe, we feel your pain. We want to get you scholars back in the archives ASAP. Even though many of our archives are closed, it's not too different from pre-COVID days, when many archival repositories, for one reason or another, do not have open access. If faculty mentors are guiding students, they should move them toward projects that A, have an open access policy, and B, can work with students to get digital materials into their hands. For the latter, the intensity of conversation is very important. What I mean is this: students need to get on the phone and walk the archivist through their interests. The archivist knows the collections best and can end up saving the student or patron lots of time. They may also be aware of other collections that are useful, and then points to the University of Illinois libraries as a fine model of this. So I can speak from an independent research library perspective and say that we have just as much limited access as anyone right now, and it varies greatly from institution to institution, what we can physically access or digitally access. And I know that librarians and archivists are really hoping that this can be a moment to kind of team up and see what's needed. So that's one comment. Another one that I have here that I'll put to the panel: given that digitization projects have been underway a few years now, Wouldn't researchers or the AHA benefit from advocating for increased public, private, or jointly funded digitization projects at major national archives or any archive, really? And perhaps focus on the digitization of indices or finding aids that could kind of help you do the legwork. So what do you think about that, about the AHA's role or our role as researchers in assisting that kind of project?
I'll just jump in quickly and say I think it would be wonderful if the AHA, together with sister organizations, would make the case for greater funding for the National Archives for just this sort of work. Again, I think funding anything in the humanities at the federal level is difficult, but things like that might be sort of put forward as ideas that help the American people understand sort of their own history or something to that effect, right? And I guess the same thing could happen in many other places as well. But again, I think as Chris pointed out, you know, there is sort of a difficulty in associations speaking as a single voice. It's important that the AHA work together with others so that it sounds as if there are communities putting forward these ideas. Again, I mean, you know, I wish there were donors for everything. And again, you know, it's one of those things where sometimes I think that there are institutions out there that have huge endowments for this sort of stuff, and they need to think creatively about what that donor intent really is meant to do, right?
Sara, can you give a perspective here from kind of graduate students and early career folks about the opportunity here for AHA to advocate on some of these projects?
Yeah, I think it would be great if the AHA would do that. In terms of like concrete things that can be done, I know we have our annual meeting coming up in January, and I can bring this up at that meeting. And also the Graduate and Early Career Committee is meeting via Zoom this fall, so I can raise those points. If nothing else, it will get the kind of the ball rolling. But I do think every time somebody brings up these points, it reminds us, oh, this is a thing we really need to be focusing on. So all of those suggestions I think are great and much appreciated.
We have another comment in the chat about the database corporations, ProQuest, Lexis, and the commentator says they've failed to step up to the challenge and meet the community halfway by significantly lowering costs or fees. The Internet Archive has a large number of free historical and archival collections, but it's not terribly useful yet for pure historical research. One free database that historians may not go to right away because it's known for genealogy, but has a great deal of historical documents, is FamilySearch.org. I'm using it now to research the French and Indian War in New England. It isn't all about where Grandpa was born. Using the unindexed collections has been very fruitful. So kind of turning up some resources that we may not have thought of before sounds like it's something we've encountered some surprises in our research too during this limited access period. Can any of you kind of talk a little bit about a research surprise that you've had, that you kind of uncovered something you didn't expect to in the last few months, what with all the restrictions?
You know, I think I tend to complain about everything, so this is a complaint as well as a comment. I was looking for local newspapers dealing with a certain program under the HUD sort of management program in the early 70s, and there were all of these newspapers available in a Google newspaper thing. And then I saved some of them, and then I went in like 2 weeks later, and apparently the publishers of those newspapers had said, you know, no. So the other thing is that the problem with a lot of these things is that you're chasing sort of the gray area between what the rights of the publisher are and what the rights of Google or some other company is, right? And I think for me, the one thing that I would love to see is all of that stuff that Google scanned, the entire University of Michigan library, where they went and started blocking it out at the request of publishers, right? So those things are now really limited. Maybe some collaborative effort to get those things available. Those are bigger questions than I think the AHA is really in a good position to answer, but they can advocate for something about like making things available that are out there. My guess is all those things are still scanned and in some of those giant server farms that Google has, but we can't get to them. And so thinking about how things that are already available can be made more available, even if it means you need to log in through a university EDU or something like that, right? I mean, I don't know how it would work, but I was really impressed to see all those things and then really sad a few weeks later to see them all go.
Sara, any final thoughts that you want to share with folks doing historical research right now? Any message to reiterate?
I wanted to mention, actually, I've been, given the circumstances, I've been looking around for other options, as everyone else has been, for research sources. And I started looking more at museum websites, which are, I think, are often an underutilized resource. And I work on, something very specific, the history of birth control and abortion. And in my endless late night searches on the internet, found that there's like a museum of birth control and abortion in the exact time period that I study. And I found that I could trace the products I study in Asia all the way across the globe using resources from this obscure Austrian museum's collections or whatever. My point being that I think with enough digging and a little bit of reframing, it is possible to find really cool things. Normally, I would never be relying on, Austrian libraries for things about China, but in this case, it worked. And so I guess there is some sort of silver lining.
Thanks, Sara. Dana, any final thoughts?
I wish I had more time to do research. But I do think that archivists are extremely responsive. And if this is just reiterating what other people said earlier, but if you write with specific documents in mind, I have heard from my younger colleagues who are trying to finish work that, I mean, they received a huge treasure trove of photographs of these documents just upon asking. So people are at work, even if the archive is closed. And then I just want to reiterate how important it is to care for our graduate students and our undergrads in this very stressful time, and for our more vulnerable faculty, young faculty trying to establish themselves, associate professors trying to write their second books, full professors dealing with all kinds of issues. So I agree with you, Sara. Let's go for compassion.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank all of you on this panel, Dana, Marc, Sara Weichsel and the American Historical Association, and Chris Boyer, for kind of bringing us together to talk through some of the ideas. You can explore the statement about doing historical research during COVID-19 on the AHA's website. You should stay tuned to the AHA's Facebook and Twitter feeds for all kinds of free resources and webinars related to this and many more topics. And I just want to really thank you all. I think the message I'm coming away with from everyone here is communicate, collaborate, and do your research trusting that there's a community of scholars behind you to support you, and you're part of it. So I want to thank you all very much, and that's a wrap for us today.